Professor Sachs, it's always great to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
So, unfortunately, when we've talked pretty much over the last 2 years, we've always had various American wars to talk about, and today is no exception. I guess in some way it's the nature of being an American. Let's start with the one that's going on for the longest, which is the war in Ukraine. I think every time in the past when we've spoken, we've talked about how it seems very difficult to imagine the Ukrainians winning in the way that the West defined victory, namely expelling the Russians from every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea. And yet the Western press has been painting a very rosy picture of how the Ukrainians are feisty and how they're performing better than anyone would think. Finally now, clearly the media narrative has shifted in the West. Even I think the U.S. government's tone has shifted. And it's obvious now that the Russians are breaking through Ukrainian front lines, are advancing, are gaining territory, while the Ukrainians are gaining none. And even the Ukrainians, everyone except Zelensky, I think, admits the situation is pretty dire. What do you make of the situation just on the battleground in terms of the war itself?
Of course, the Ukrainians are being beaten. But what's very interesting, Glenn, and exactly in your line of work, if one listened not to the Western media, but also to the Russian channels and to independent media over the years, it's not as if there was some sudden change. What is happening right now, which is the defeat of Ukraine on the battlefield, is a steady process that's been happening now for more than 2 years. So there's no dramatic moment of change. There has been a war of attrition that Russia has been winning. The propaganda in the West has disguised that. And even until today, you have absurdly optimistic statements by Secretary Blinken and others. But if you listen to the facts on the ground, not in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Institute for the Study of War or all of the British media, but a much wider range of news, nothing that's happening now is a surprise or even a shift from the underlying trend that has been underway now for 2 years. After all, Ukraine was completely bloodied and failed in its so-called counteroffensive last summer. It already lost significant areas, Bakhmut and others, in the spring of last year on its key defense lines in the Donbass. So what's happening now, which is dramatic, is not a surprise, and it's not even a decisive change of direction, except in the Western media.
I think, as somebody who covers free speech and censorship and debates adjacent to it quite often, one of the most extreme things I've seen in, let's say, the last 5 years, maybe even the last decade along those lines, is that the EU, just a couple of months into this war, made it illegal to give a platform to any Russian state media, such as RT or Sputnik. So if you as an American adult or a European adult, more specifically, more accurately, wanted to hear what the Russian media was saying, wanted to hear what the Russian government's version of events was, not to believe it, but just to have the comparison, hearing both sides, it was basically a crime to platform them. And the platform that our show is on, which is Rumble, is actually banned in France as a result of their refusal to remove RT and Sputnik. And so this information bubble was deliberately cultivated, and I think did quite an effective job in propagandizing the citizenry, to the point probably a lot of people are shocked that Russia actually is doing so well. Now, one of the arguments that war proponents are making, because war proponents in the United States never admit error. There's never a moment where they say, our predictions about the war didn't come true, it was misguided, it was an error, we made a lot of false assumptions. What they're now trying to say is, yes, Russia is winning, but the reason for that is that the Republicans held up the $60 billion package for so long in Congress, namely for about 3 months. And if you go back in history, you look at every war where the U.S. failed in its objectives, and they always make that same argument. Oh, we were constrained by war opponents. We would have won in Vietnam had it not been for the protest movement. We would have won in Iraq had they unleashed more force. We would have won in Afghanistan had we stayed longer. We would have won in Syria had Obama not tied the hands of the CIA. That's obviously what they're saying now. As you said, the evidence of Ukraine's failures predate by a long time the Republican impediment for a couple months or 3 months of the $60 billion package. But what do you make of that argument? What's your response to it?
First, let me say a word about the European bubble, because I lived in Vienna for much of last year. I was completely shocked. Even when I was scheduled to give a public address or an interview, sometimes the venues would cancel because they didn't want to hear an independent, objective, scholarly assessment. They were afraid, that is too much pro-Russian. I'm pro-peace, by the way. I'm pro-truth. So it wasn't pro-Russian or not pro-Russian. It was pro-facts. But I saw the bubble in shocking ways all through Europe. I had the experience, Glenn, after Nord Stream blew up. The U.S. blew it up, if anyone is still curious about that fact. But when I said it on American television, I was canceled within literally 30 seconds and then subjected to a rant by the anchor for a few minutes. How dare he say these things? But then I was canceled in Europe the same way, in a very strange way, because I was an unpaid but formal advisor to the EU diplomatic corps, just as an academic expert. And when I said that, yes, the U.S. blew up Nord Stream, I was immediately, quote, fired. Again, there was nothing commercial in it, no funding, but I was taken off the list. They do not want to hear any of this. And this is absolutely amazing. So we have been living in this completely false narrative. It is absolutely not true that this delay in the armaments has to do with anything, by the way. Look at what our General Petraeus said last year about Ukraine's counteroffensive. It's interesting to go back and read how Ukraine's going to prove it's going to slash right through the Russian defenses and so forth. And all of this optimism and blather that we heard so many times in the U.S., and it was all completely wrong, completely. And when it proved completely wrong, no one ever had even a story to say, well, what happened? We said, somebody said this, and it turned out to be this. Isn't that interesting? If you follow this story closely, essentially, the U.S. has been gambling repeatedly. They've been gambling with a guaranteed losing hand. This is important to understand. Obama did figure this out back in 2014. He figured out that Russia has what was called then escalatory dominance, that whatever we do, Russia would escalate. Why? Because for Russia, the stakes of what's going on in Ukraine are existential, but for us, it's a geopolitical game. Not more than a game, by the way, and that's how it's viewed by these game theorists. They want NATO in Ukraine. So everything, Glenn, that they banked on proved to be wrong. And the group that was banking on it is the same group as today. It was Biden, Sullivan, Newland, who's now my colleague at Columbia University. Right. She's out. But Blinken, it's the same group. Now, they gambled in 2014 that they could help to instigate a coup, and that all would kind of settle down in the U.S. favor. Gamble wrong, because Putin did what he said he would do. No way you guys are taking away our Sevastopol naval base just because you launch a coup. And so Russia took back Crimea with that referendum in 2014, in March 2014. Okay, that was the first gamble wrong. Second gamble, there was the outbreak of ethnic Russians who did not want to be under this coup-led government of the Ukrainian nationalists. And so this insurrection started in the Donbass. And Russia actually said very constructively, peace and autonomy for this region. That was the Minsk agreements. And not only were there agreements reached on how to end this post-coup conflict that our side didn't count on, but they were agreements that were backed by the UN Security Council and backed by Germany and France. U.S. gamble number 2, blow off these agreements. Privately agree with Ukraine. No need to do any of that. We had our experts here saying how decentralization in Ukraine would be a bad idea. Don't give autonomy to the region. Okay, failed again. Then, because the war continued, then Putin put on the table a security arrangement with the United States, a draft on December 15, 2021. I called the White House afterward. I think you and I have spoken about that. I told them, negotiate, avoid this war. Well, they gambled again. They felt, what's Putin going to do? It's all a bluff. We don't have to negotiate over NATO enlargement. Nah, nothing too much terrible is going to happen. That's what I heard. Wrong. Gambled again. Then in March 2022, just essentially 3 weeks after the launch of Russia's special military operation, we can't say this started the war because that started in 2014, but the escalation of the war that started on February 24th, 2022, Ukraine said, okay, we'll be neutral. And under the auspices of Turkish mediators, they essentially initialed an agreement, very close. The U.S. stepped in and told Zelensky, you don't have to do this. We've got HIMARS coming your way. We've got tanks coming your way. We've got crushing financial sanctions coming your way. We've got your back. This was another gamble. This was another escalation of a losing hand on the U.S. side. What these people, Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Nuland, can't get is that for Russia, this is really national security. For these people, it's a game. It's a game of expanding NATO. NATO doesn't have to be in Ukraine for U.S. security. It's to be in Ukraine to, quote, weaken Russia or to surround Russia. But for Russia, Russia doesn't want the U.S. on their border. And so our side does absolutely not understand that they cannot get their way. All they can do is drive Ukraine into dust, into now 500,000 deaths of Ukrainians, and the number is soaring now, often 1,000 a day, 1,500 a day, because there's a bloodbath underway. But nothing is shocking except the stupidity of the U.S. policy, which has gambled and gambled and gambled. But I guess it's not their lives, it's not their money, it's Ukrainian lives, it's American people's money. So they don't care about this gambling, it seems. But nothing is a surprise, Glenn.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.